It's always hard to get going again after spring break. So anyway, we'll see how. And I just wanted to draw you. I've started these lectures by drawing your attention to various different things, and I was just given in the science supplement of the New York Times today. Those of you who didn't see it, a profile in science by Carl Zimmer, which is a whole article on the DNA evidence of the migration of Neanderthals and then Homo sapiens from Africa, and kind of looks like he pinched my lecture. I don't know, we'll see. So if you haven't read it, probably worth checking out. So what I want to talk about today, we'll say my second Turner painting for those of you who are into the artistic introduction to the class. Okay, so before spring break, I talked a little bit about the Atlantic economy, and particularly about the development of slave-based sugar production in the West Indies, and thinking about that as a sort of powerhouse of profit generation. The production of investable capital, surplus capital, by the mercantile elites in England. Some of them were merchants who'd got rich. Some of them were members of the old nobility who had decided to enter market agriculture and invest in overseas trade. By the middle of the 1700s, they had quite a lot of surplus capital. There's only so much you can spend on ostentatious display, fancy country houses, etc., etc. And they were looking for other investment opportunities. It so happened that this period kind of coincided with we touched on this briefly before, the beginning of or the stepping up of the British colonial effort, occupation of the Indian subcontinent, led by the East India Company, British East India Company, and the export back to Britain of cheap, very high quality Indian cotton textiles. The background here is a printed calico cloth manufactured in India, and the British clothing manufacturers wanted to be able to compete more effectively with these imports. They tried for a while to keep them out, not altogether successfully. The demand for high quality cotton goods was very high in Britain, and instead the English cotton manufacturers began to invest in ways of producing more cheaply, primarily by the mechanization, first of all of spinning of cotton thread, and then of weaving cotton cloth. I know that is probably not the standard version. We got some tree knocking against the power line, I'm afraid, so if the lights flicker a little bit. I know that's probably not the standard version of the origins of the Industrial Revolution that you've heard, but I really like that explanation. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it situates the Industrial Revolution in England in a global context. That's to say, as a response to competition from India via the British East India Company. So we get it. There's a significant impetus, a significant stimulus to invest some of this surplus capital in production methods that are going to allow British manufacturers to produce more cheaply than their Indian competitors. What you get, of course, is the development in Britain from the middle of the 1700s onwards, 1750s, 1760s onwards, of the Industrial Revolution. And This is sort of pretty boilerplate description of some of the main factors producing what's referred to as industrial takeoff in Britain. So the investable profits I've been referring to, the importance of the sugar trade, the increased agricultural productivity, the breeding of more productive livestock, the greater clearance of many of the old small peasant farms, the amalgamation into larger farming units, new crops, the rising agricultural productivity. Workers, former agricultural workers, former small farmers being driven off the land, going in footloose, workers going into the cities looking for employment, rising population, and of course the availability of a new source of power, of steam power. The first steam engine, the Newcomen engine, developed in 1712, used for pumping water out of coal mines, but by the time we get to the 1760s and 1770s, engines like this, this Boulton and Watt engine in the bottom panel here, rotary motion. You can run belts off that, drive belts off that. You can drive looms, and ultimately you can drive all kinds of other machinery from it. So a series of factors kind of coming together from the middle of the 1700s to begin to produce a sustained burst of industrial development in England. And the first factor that I start with here, the constitutional monarchy, a system of parliamentary democracy in Britain, established, of course, in the English Revolution, the English Civil War in the 1640s and 50s that we talked about a couple of classes ago, lectures ago, very much putting the mercantile elites in the driving seat of British policy. So how the Navy was going to be used to help develop and expand overseas trade, how Parliament was going to be used to facilitate moving peasant farmers off the land, etc., etc., etc. So this constellation of factors coming together, initially on a very narrow front, in one branch of one industry, that's to say in the spinning branch of the cotton clothing industry, but very quickly by the end of the 1700s, weaving itself becomes mechanized, and then as you get into the early 1800s, a whole range of other industries begin to develop. Industrial revolution gathers momentum in Britain. The top left-hand illustration, the ziggy red line, is percentage growth of railroad track per year. So you can see in some of those early years, 1830s, you're getting 50% increase in railroad mileage in Britain in a single year. The blue line is the overall cumulative increase in railroad mileage. So you're seeing a gigantic expansion of railroad construction in Britain during the 1840s and 1850s. Yeah.
In the prior picture, you had a picture transferring power from the piston to the wheel.
Yeah.
That was in use in the Ticonderoga, the side wheeler that's in the Shelburne Museum now.
Yeah, very similar, and they basically developed that technology by the end of the 1760s, 1770s. And once you were able to generate rotary motion, then all of these other things to some degree follow. So here's the expansion of railroad production, steamships. This is the Great Eastern. Actually, it was pretty much a failure as a commercial ship, but they used it to lay the first transatlantic telegraph cable in the 1860s. So you're going to see, of course, coming along with this greater connectivity, communication, advances in communication. All of this demands the manufacturing, skilled manufacturing, machining, steel production, iron ore production, coal mining. I mean, all of this constellation of developments emerging from the late 1700s and accelerating in England, accelerating very, very rapidly in the early 1800s. The percentage of the population in England that lived in the cities, the urban population, rising from about 17% at the start of the century in 1801 to 72% by 1891 in a 90-year period. So fantastic increase. So by the 1860s, 1870s, the majority of the English population is an urban population. It's sort of worth noting by comparison that doesn't happen in the United States until the 1920s. So you get a little measure of the rapidity of the development of industrial society in Britain. And of course, everything that we are increasingly familiar with thinking about today that goes along with that. Urban society, the increasing use of coal, the fossil fuel carbon emissions going on with that, the increasing, as I put it, thickening of the Anthropocene, the accelerating human impact on the environment, and this very typical scene here of the English Midlands. You can, a lot of semi-racist comment on air quality in China today. This is not so far distant from the industrial heritage of England, and of course of the other major Western countries. And this begins to spread outwards to the most to some parts of Western Europe, to the Rhine Valley in Germany, to parts of France, to parts of northern Italy. And of course, very rapidly across the Atlantic, the Americans are very good at stealing British technology, and the industrialization of the American cotton spinning and weaving in the northern states, coming right along with all this. Sort of worth adding, I think, the consequence for India is absolutely devastating. As soon as the British are able to produce cotton cloth more cheaply than the Indians are producing it, the quality's never actually as good, but it's certainly much cheaper, produced by machinery. The British begin actually exporting finished cotton goods to India, and within 20 or 30 years, the domestic cotton industry in India is basically wiped out, and India is going to become typically, as we would now think of it, typically dependent colonial relationship. In other words, exporting raw materials and importing finished product from Britain. So the consequences of the Industrial Revolution having a very broad international character. I want to just say one thing about one particular aspect of this, which is, I think, particularly dramatic. Where's the cotton coming from? Some of it, of course, is coming from parts of the British Empire, Egypt in particular, but a great deal of it is coming from the United States. So one of the sort of great ironies of 19th century history is the most productive, the most modern, the most dynamic and innovative economic activity in the world is totally and intimately connected with the expansion of chattel slavery in the United States. So the right-hand chart there, 1790, the darker the red is the percentage of slaves in the various counties. So 50% and over of the population enslaved is the darkest color there. So you can see in 1790, pretty much exclusively parts of the the Virginia Tidewater, the South Carolina indigo and rice plantations in the coastal South Carolina. By 1860, by the start of the Civil War, the gigantic expansion of slave-based cotton production in the Mississippi Valley, in particular, and that whole great belt of dense slave populations extending from South Carolina, Georgia, westwards, and in fact, by this time, the old slave plantations of Virginia are essentially just producing slaves. They are not. By this time, the tobacco production has pretty much collapsed, and they basically grow slaves who are then exported to the slave plantations in the South. So, kind of interesting to think about that relationship in a certain sense, and this is something we may want to come back to in the discussion. I really want to emphasize the dynamism of the slave economy. It's often sort of presented as this was all dying out in some fashion. On the contrary, the price of prime male field hands reached an all-time high in 1859, 1860. The demand for slaves was extremely high as the slave economy in the South, as the slave owners are looking for new ways to expand either into the West. You can see on the map there, of course, the Missouri becoming a slave state after 1820, and other proposals, expansion of American slavery into Cuba, into Nicaragua, into other parts of Central America. Yeah.
Slavery was banned in Britain. What date?
Slavery is outlawed in the British Empire in the 1830s. But the slave trade was outlawed in the U.S. Constitution in 1808 or 1809, I forget, which is, of course, the reason why the internal production of slaves becomes so important there's a lot of smuggling of slaves as well from Cuba and elsewhere, but the domestic production of slaves becomes particularly important. Okay, so that's the economic background, or social and economic background. There's a couple of the other things I want to talk about tonight. The radical transformation of capitalism, first in Britain, then in parts of Western Europe and the United States, from mercantile, trading-based, small manufacturing-based model towards industrial economies. Recognizably modern industrial economies. This process is invariably intertwined with political transformations. If you think back, we've already talked about a couple of these: the English Civil War, English Revolution, if you want to use that term. I think it's appropriate. In the middle of the 1600s, the Dutch Revolt, the Dutch War for Independence, the establishment of an independent Dutch Republic, were in their own way, of course, political consequences of the establishment of capitalism. And now we're going to see this on an accelerated pace. If you think about Britain and the Dutch Revolt from the 1560s to the 1640s, the English Civil War from the 1640s to the 1660s, if you think about those as a sort of first wave of these national democratic revolutions that are forming modern nation states, the second wave really begins in the later part of the 1700s. And of course, we're going to look at the American Revolution in the top left here, 1775. the French Revolution in 1789, and then a whole wave of revolutions in the Spanish Empire, Mexico, the northern part of South America, and then the southern cone of South America in the 1800s. So I want to sort of think about those sort of being grouped together as a second wave of these national democratic revolutions. The American Revolution's a real revolution. Maybe we don't have to argue that anymore, but for a long time, it's not just a war to get the British out, although it is a war to get the British out. It's a war that's connected to the social transformation of the American colonies. It's one of the bloodiest revolutions. It's tied to an intense civil war between those who remain loyal to the crown and those who support the patriotic cause, which is a very violent local militia-based kind of war. Proportionate to the population, there are more exiles after the American Revolution than after the French Revolution. I mean, more people permanently leave the country as a consequence of their side being defeated in the Revolutionary War. Enormous amounts of land are expropriated in the American Revolution, taken from the loyalists, the supporters of the English crown, and distributed amongst the supporters of the revolution. It transforms the social base of the American economy, making it a state that is really based on small property-owning farmers. As a consequence of that revolution, it wasn't for nothing that Thomas Jefferson inscribed the famous proclamation in support of liberty, equality, and property. I know that's not how you know it, but it is what he wrote in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, but felt that on reflection they felt that pursuit of happiness or some similar drivel, meaningless really, right? Sort of replaced, sounded better than a state that was explicitly founded on the defense of property rights. But it was. I don't say that to criticize it. It was a revolutionary transformation at the time, but it is useful to see it for what it was. Well, I should say that the state that emerges from the American Revolution, maybe we can get into this a little bit more in the discussion. If I go back to the previous map, the map's sort of going to tell you right away that this is not going to be a very unified state. That it's actually based on two antithetical social systems. Free market capitalism from the beginning. Free market capitalism in the north and slave production in the south. It's the reason, of course, why so-called states' rights is so profoundly inscribed into the American Constitution. And the state itself is the overall state structure of the American nation is a sort of cobbled together compromise between those two antithetical elements. Which doesn't actually last for that long, as you are aware. So these revolutions are interconnected. The American Revolution, I don't say it wins because of the French, but it's certainly helpful that the French rejoin their long war with the British, and as part of that war, fight on the side of the. This is monarchical France, right? Fight on the side of the Republican Americans to get rid of the British. In the course of doing that, the French bankrupt themselves, and the French monarchy is forced to raise exceptional taxes. The only way they can do that after a certain point is by summoning the Estates General, which was a kind of medieval parliament in France, which has representation of what the French was referred to as the third estate, which was basically anyone who wasn't a priest or a noble, i.e. the vast majority of the population. They're mostly represented by lawyers. in France. But once that body had been convened, it basically refuses to disperse until it's been granted a whole series of democratic rights, broadly modelled on those of the American Revolution, and of course the monarchy tries to resist, compromises more and more. As in the American Revolution, more and more of the poor, the dispossessed, the sans-culottes in French, those without the fancy breeches of the elite, get drawn into political action. The revolution goes far beyond the original intent of any of its founders, ends up executing the king as they had done in England. Invaded by German, Prussian and Austrian armies, fights a revolutionary war to defend itself, and of course in the course of that is transformed from a revolutionary republic step by step by the end of the 1700s into a new empire, the empire of Napoleon. In the course of Napoleon's wars, Napoleon invades Spain in 1808, basically smashes the French monarchy, which has a pretty detrimental effect on the capacity of the Spanish to hold on to their American colonies. And from the first decade of the 1800s, you see the beginnings of a whole series of revolutions in South America. Probably the most famous, led by Simón Bolívar in what he termed Gran Colombia, a new revolutionary state that encompassed the modern states of Colombia, Venezuela, and part of Ecuador. It doesn't last more than his lifetime. He dies in 1830. The state disintegrated. That sort of larger state disintegrated shortly afterwards. The Mexican Revolution, after first of all crushing the peasant uprisings in the early part of the 1800s, then is finally successful, establishes an independent state in Mexico in 1821. So throughout Latin America, throughout Latin America, we see a series of political revolutions, overthrowing Spanish rule, establishing new nation states. I just want to draw particular attention to the revolution in Haiti, inspired directly by the French Revolution, of course, led by Toussaint Louverture, a former slave himself, and has the amazing military capacity to defeat, first of all, a British invasion and then a French invasion, and establish the Second Free Republic in the Americas. Unfortunately, for the Haitians, the First Free Republic wasn't particularly thrilled about being joined by a successful slave rebellion, and refused any diplomatic or political contact with Haiti or to trade with Haiti, essentially, you can trace the current situation of Haiti to its treatment immediately after and continuing throughout the 1800s of having the temerity to conduct a massively successful slave rebellion. In the other states in Latin America, you never have the sort of mobilization of small farmers that you have in the United States. Those classes are largely absent in the Latin American states. So you have relatively weak states formed with strong elites, military elites, militaries that customarily intervene in politics. In in the Mexican case, Santa Anna, I think, is president 11 times or something like that, intervening over and over in political life, and who integrate these new states into the emerging world economy, essentially as raw material producers rather than as industrializing nation states in their own right. Okay, so I want to just sort of stand back from that little sort of touching on some of the political developments and just say that this, in terms of sort of global power, this really expresses itself in sort of two models. The little inset at the top here, the blue is the Napoleonic Empire, so France itself, directly ruling parts of Italy, French allied states in Spain, in Austria, in Prussia, in Poland, in Denmark, a huge continental bloc under the control of the Napoleonic Empire. That's one sort of model of state development, power development that we see being pushed very strongly by Napoleon, a sort of territorial model of imperial expansion. If you think back, we talked a little bit about Charles V of France, Charles V of Spain, and the importance of the American silver and all of that stuff. That was a previous effort to establish a sort of European imperial state. If you think forward, think of Nazi Germany and a later attempt to establish a sort of supranational imperial state in Europe. Well, the rival model, if you like, not fundamentally a model of territorial empire, although it includes a good chunk of territory, but fundamentally a model of economic dominance, economic empire. So the bigger map behind, the continued development, the reorientation of British imperial power after the loss of the American colonies, the reorientation of that power particularly to the east and to Africa, the expansion of British rule in India. It's not shown on the map a little bit later into Burma, into the Malay Peninsula, into Australia, New Zealand, the southern Cape, and of course increasingly into outposts on the coast of Africa itself, Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, Nigeria, etc. But an empire that's basically, although it, as I say, controls a good chunk of territory, is a trading empire, is a mercantile empire, in which the profit, the wealth of that empire is continually reinforcing what's actually a very tiny territorial homeland in the British Isles. I mean, it's a little bit more substantial than the Dutch Empire we looked at earlier, but not that much more. But it enables the British, enables the British ruling class, enables the City of London to become the premier financial centre in the world. The pound sterling becomes the main currency of global exchange. The London insurance market, the other London money markets become the premier centre of global finance. And of course, by the time we get into the early 1800s, this is as an industrial power. So Britain's sort of leading the Industrial Revolution in the way that I began by describing is going to is going to reinforce all of this process. Tiny little Britain there is sort of pumping out in vast quantities manufactured products for sale around the world. By the 1840s, the idea of free trade has become the sort of unofficial state religion of Britain. the British ruling class. The idea that free trade, it's sort of immoral to keep foreign competition. No one should put up trade barriers. Goods should be able to circulate freely. I mean, you will find that free trade is always the doctrine of the premier economic power in any epoch, the power that can produce more cheaply, more efficiently than its rivals, and therefore doesn't want to see any let or hindrance on their importation into other economies. It's also a sign of the decline of imperial power, that protectionism, the keeping out of foreign trade comes back onto the agenda. It's certainly true in the British Empire and undoubtedly is true in the American Empire.
Is this maintained by the large Navy?
It's supported by the British Royal Navy, absolutely. Britain always has a very, very small army. Which they much prefer to pay other people to do land fighting for them, but it's basically policed by the British Royal Navy, which is constructed on what they call the two-power standard, which is to say the British Navy should be at least twice as big. It should be at least as big as its next two rivals combined. So it's going to always have a very substantial margin of superiority. So this is so free trade and the big navy sort of go hand in hand.
And the industrial capacity to build that.
And the industrial capacity, the shipbuilding capacity. I mean, they're also, of course, building a big merchant fleet at the same time, steam-powered merchant fleet at the same time. Anyway, this begins to get blocked in China by the middle of the 1840s. The Qing dynasty, I talked a little bit in previous lecture about the sort of cyclical pattern of Chinese imperial dynastic history. The Qing dynasty beginning in the middle of the 1644, a invasion of China, of southern China essentially from Manchuria. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the details of Qing rule or Manchu rule. If anyone's interested in the questions, we can get a little bit deeper into that. But as the Ming dynasty before it, huge centralized state, by far the most populous centralized state in the world, exercising tribute, collecting tribute from its neighbors, Korea, modern day Korea, Vietnam, Burma, Thailand, etc. Huge regional superpower. Integrated economy, sophisticated canal system, movement of products throughout China, essentially movement of rice from the Yangtze Valley northwards to feed the northern urban population. A heavily taxed peasantry, small peasant farmers, mounting pressure on the land, dividing the plots into smaller and smaller holdings. So we start to see a decline in the productivity of peasant agriculture in China, and very, very typically the merchants viewed by the state with a great deal of suspicion. Merchants, as they had been in the Ming dynasty, are a sort of necessary evil. They're always a bit worrying because they have the capacity to become independently wealthy, and of course, with wealth comes the possibility of political challenge. So the ideal of the Chinese ideal, the elite ideal, remains one of serving in the scholar gentry, serving in the state administration, rather than making a ton of money in business. So China trying to essentially insulate itself from foreign competition, from foreign trade, and of course connected to that from internal in the development of an internal merchant elite. This is regulated by what they refer to as the Guangzhou system or the Canton system. Basically, the Qing say the foreign traders can come to one port in China, Guangzhou. They're only going to be allowed to come to that port for a certain number of months each year. They're not going to be allowed to travel inland into China. They're not going to be allowed to learn Chinese, so they're not going to be able to have direct contact with Chinese merchants. Their Chinese products, will be brought to Guangzhou. They'll be sold directly to the merchants at fixed prices. So very sort of strict regulation of the trade with Britain and the other Western powers. Well, the British kind of go along with that. British East India Company goes along with that for some period. But by the 1840s, the British are beginning to establish themselves in Burma, and they come up with basically a brilliant plan, which is that if we can find a product that the Chinese can't refuse, we can use that to sort of batter down the trade barriers that the Chinese have erected. And of course, the brilliance of the plan is that it's going to be the export of opium produced in Burma and in India, and in the 1840s and early 1840s, and then in the middle of the 1850s, for a second time, the British are going to fight two wars with China, essentially to force the Chinese to abandon the Guangzhou system and to permit free trade, or at least a more expanded trade. And the sort of spear point of that is to force the importation of enormous quantities of opium. Not surprisingly, the British don't say we're going to war to force you to smoke dope. They say they're going to war in defense of the principles of free trade, which have been so egregiously violated by the Chinese. The consequence of the two opium wars is a series of what are referred to as unequal treaties. First with the British, then with the French, the Americans, the Germans, Italians, and a series of other states who all negotiate with China to open up new ports and gain new access to the Chinese to the Chinese market. So as you get into the second half of the 19th century, you see this accelerating intervention into China. Not only Britain, although the British, of course, British acquire Hong Kong, I should say, at the end of the Opium War, which is where the British actual physical outpost in China comes from. The French wage a war with China, which results in the French gaining control of what becomes French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Kampuchea. The Japanese go to war with China at the end of the century, 1894, and gain control of northeastern China, of Manchuria. So you see this accelerating European effort to get into and to dominate the Chinese market, to that drive to find new markets for the industrially produced commodities of the Western industrial economies. Under the pressure of this, the Chinese state starts to fragment, probably most dramatically in the Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 1800s. This is a massive peasant revolt. centered in the southern part of China. It's led by a guy who proclaims himself the younger brother of Jesus. At first, the British are really, really excited about this. They think that maybe they are actually Christians, and maybe they can form an alliance with the Taiping against the Qing, who they're currently fighting to force them to smoke dope. So it would have been a handy alliance for the British. But they actually send some British emissaries to the Taiping rebels capture Nanjing, the capital, and the British send some emissaries there, and they say, no, these people really are not what we understand as Christians. They have regiments of armed women. They've outlawed foot binding. They have a lot of religious kookery going on, but it's pretty obvious that there's a serious social revolution unfolding in this territory. So the British decide that it's probably better to join forces with the Qing and crush the Taiping than support them, which they do. They're also helped by some American mercenaries. Staggering figure: 20 million Chinese peasants die in the overthrow of the Taiping rebellion and the waves of famine that follow it. So undoubtedly the largest casualties of any war of the 19th century, dwarfs the casualties of the American Civil War, for example, and almost unknown in the West. But anyway. I'm essentially citing it here. I mean, one could argue this is an attempt at one of those sort of democratic type revolutions that we've seen in other parts of the world, but it's of course now being conducted in a world where there are major imperial powers with their own interests and agendas. Okay, so what we're really talking about here is the sort of unfolding of the Great Divergence, which has been probably one of the sort of hottest subjects in global history in the last 15 years or so. The debate, the discussion, the grappling with where did the divergence come from? Where did the fact that China had been the largest, most well-organized, most populous, blah, blah, state in the world, and then clearly over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, a gigantic divergence opens up between patterns of development in China and those in the West. So the top left-hand illustration is a population of red is China, blue is continental Europe. The point of it, of course, is to show that population is increasing sort of broadly parallel in both regions. The right-hand chart, bottom right-hand chart, is gross domestic product per capita. In other words, divide the gross domestic product into the population, and you see, of course, a dramatically different picture. The red line there zooming up the chart is gross domestic product per capita in Britain. The chart ends in 1950, and China is this blue line. Right, this sort of teal-coloured line right at the bottom. So you can see from sort of all of these being a sort of broadly similar frame starting in 1500, and here's the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, and the divergence really opening up. And what I've been trying to explain is the causes of that divergence. I think maybe what we'll come on to talk about next week is it's certainly, I think, arguable that what you see in the world today is the global convergence rather than the divergence, the reversal of that pattern, with, of course, enormous consequences for the entire future of the world. We'll no doubt get into a little bit of that next week, but I do want to just touch on one or two other things before I finish tonight, to sort of finish this picture of the 18th century, which will then set up the final lecture, which will really be on the 19th and finish with the 19th century, which will set up the next and final lecture, which will be on the 20th century. Menno, could you get me some water? Okay, so I want to turn back to Europe. I want to turn back to politics. I want to talk a little bit about 1848, a wave of revolutions really right across Europe from one end of the other to the other. Kind of different, somewhat different issues in different places. In France, this is the final overthrow of the French monarchy, the establishment of the Second Republic in Paris. In Italy, a revolution to bring about the unification of the Italian peninsula, all the small little states and principalities of the Italian peninsula. In Germany, a revolution to create a unified German nation state out of all the small states and principalities there. A revolution in the Austro-Hungarian Empire to fight for the independence of the constituent states of the Austrian Empire. So a whole series of revolutions. I don't have time to really go into their connection their connection to the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars and all of that kind of stuff. I just want to simply assert here, these are in general revolutions to sort of try and establish those kind of democratic unified nation states that had been formed in Britain, and the Dutch Republic in the first wave of those revolutions had been formed in the United States and in France in the second wave, and sort of an attempt to do that in other places in Europe. All defeated primarily by the force of the Russian conservative force of the Russian state. I should say there's a little sort of, not so little actually, there's a reflection of this in the United States. I don't think it's accidental at the Seneca Falls Conference, the first ever meeting to discuss women's rights takes place in 1848. It's part of this. It's part of a global pattern, an acceleration of the anti-slavery movement in the United States. And there's other connections we could go into, which I really don't have time to develop. So the big point I want to make here is these revolutions are all defeated. These are sort of bottom-up efforts to try and establish unified democratic nation states. They're all defeated. But the process of trying to create unified democratic nation states is not defeated. It's just carried forward by different means. That's to say, it's carried forward by sort of top-down means rather than bottom-up means. So there is, in fact, going to be another wave of revolutions. They don't necessarily look like revolutions. They look like wars of national unification. The German two German wars of unification against Austria in 1866, against France in 1871, culminates in the Great Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. So this is a product of the Prussian victory over the French in 1870 in the proclamation of the Second Reich with the German Kaiser, Prussian Kaiser, who becomes the king of a new unified Germany at its head. Sort of overlapping with this, the culmination of the struggle to create a unified Italian state. This is Giuseppe Garibaldi, so there's still a sort of populist bottom-up kind of element to the Italian unification, but there's also the actions of the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia in the northern part of the Italian peninsula. To the right here, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, so the populist popular sort of a revolutionary overthrow of the Japanese shogunate, the establishment of a unified nation for the first time in Japan, and then finally, and to include it in the same picture, the Second American Revolution, the revolutionary overthrow of slavery in the American South, the massive popular mobilization of the Union Army necessary to do that, the enormous slave rebellion that accompanies it, and the creation for the first time of a really genuinely unified American nation state, which comes right along with the rewriting of the Constitution. I know Americans don't like to think of the Constitution being rewritten. It was perfect to start off with, and so on and so forth. But, actually the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments substantially rewrite the critical elements of the entire basis of citizenship in the American Constitution. So four gigantic revolutions, but conducted from the top down. Essentially, these are not primarily sort of bottom-up popular revolutions, but the consequences are really, really dramatic. And I just want to show them in Europe. So here's a map of Europe in 1852. You can see Italy, a whole bunch of small states, the Papal States, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Tuscany, Modena, etc., 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 a whole bunch of small states. Germany, here's Prussia in the north, Bavaria, Württemberg, etc., etc., a tiny bunch of... So here's the map, here's the map in 1871. Just watch what happens in Italy and in Germany. I mean, it's an enormous transformation. I'll do it again, so if you didn't catch it first time, I love playing with this thing. I mean, if this doesn't tell you there's going to be a gigantic world war in Europe within 50 or 60 years, you just got to think about the power that this process of unification is unlocking in these. You could think about it similarly in America, of course, the power that's been unlocked by the completion of the revolution, the unification, the first genuine unification of the American nation simultaneously, or in Japan. So anyway, here we go. Bang. Gigantic, unified, modern nation states. And where we'll start next week is on the process of industrial development that goes right along with that. However, I'm going to finish on one other issue, and this is, I think, really, really important. During the 1848 revolutions, a new force emerges in politics, in European politics, and that's the organized working class. Did I have a picture there? Oh, I didn't put the right picture in. Anyway, no. Okay. So, but basically, I had a lovely photograph of the Chartist movement in London in 1848, but I obviously didn't put it. I mean, poor people, working people, artisans, small farmers had always been involved in these revolutionary movements. I mean, they drive the American Revolution forward, they drive the French Revolution forward. I mean, they were part of these, but they're sort of fighting to establish unified capitalist nation states at the end of the day. They're not really voicing, except under very exceptional circumstances, sort of independent political demands. By the time you get to 1848, the Industrial Revolution has gone far enough that in most of the major countries of Europe, there is a hereditary working class. That's to say, people who no longer have any direct ties to the land. They can't go back and be farmers. They are workers. They live by selling their labor power. They have no other means of, and there's enough of them, and they become sufficiently well organized that they start to articulate their own political demands. like shorter work, like fighting for legislation to shorten the working week, for example, or like fighting to expand suffrage, which was very, very limited to start off with to property owners in all of these countries. So you start to, by 1848, you start to get this separate and independent voice of workers, of the working class. So not only is it no accident that the Seneca Falls Convention happens in the same year, 1848, and so on. It's absolutely no accident that in precisely the same year, these two young dudes, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, in their 20s, write the Communist Manifesto. For the first time, articulate the independent course of action, independent political line, independent of the major capitalist classes. So this becomes an independent voice, an independent power, an independent force in European politics. To some degree, we're going to see it reflected in America, and of course, we're going to see it in other countries subsequently. And I'm going to end on this one thing. In 1871, the German army, the Prussian army, invades France at the end of during the Franco-Prussian War, defeats the French, proclaims the Second Empire. I've just explained all that bit. They get to Paris, they surround Paris, they besiege Paris, the French government surrenders, and a popular revolution takes place in Paris, the Paris Commune, which in many ways is the first really revolutionary working class, popular, artisan government in history. It only lasts a couple of months. It can't do a great deal, but it passes some social reforms in education and women's rights and so on and so forth, and is then violently crushed by the French government. They estimate at least 10,000 Parisians are slaughtered. Some estimates double that in the course of the suppression of the Paris Commune. But in the wake of the Paris Commune, a couple of things sort of happen. One is that all the major European governments, later on the Americans will share this opinion, become deeply concerned that if you fight a big modern war like the Franco-Prussian War, and if you lose, there's going to be a tremendous danger that working people in your own country are going to rise up in a sort of revolt, maybe on a much, much larger scale than had happened in Paris in 1871. So that sense of the connection between war and revolution is going to be established through this process. It also led Karl Marx to kind of change some of the things that he'd originally thought in the 1840s. He draws the conclusion that the working class is never going to be able to simply take hold of the government, never going to be able to be elected to office and take control of the existing government, but they're actually going to have to overthrow the existing government and establish new forms of popular democracy. So sort of diametrical opposite conclusions. The elite draw the conclusion that wars bring the danger of revolutions. Marx draws the conclusion, yes, they do, and here's how we can win. So those two perspectives are going to be very much part of how the end of the 19th century and of course into the 20th century, those are the issues. The rise of these new unified nation states, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United States, their challenge to the British-dominated world order on the one hand, and on the other hand, within all of those states, the emergence of new political forces, left-wing, radical, communist-type political forces that are going to challenge the entire structure of world politics. And really what's going to happen in the 20th century is the interplay of those forces, and we'll try and push all that into one lecture next week, and that'll be the conclusion of the series. So anyway, let's maybe take a few questions.